Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're really tackling something I think we're all thinking about. How do we adapt? In a world that feels like it's just spinning faster and faster
Yeah,
every day.
it's a great question. And I think a really fascinating place to look for answers is actually the battlefield.
Okay.
We're going to be diving into General Stanley McChrystal's book, Team of Teams,
Oh,
and
interesting.
it details his experience leading the task force in Iraq.
Okay.
Um,
I actually just started reading that.
oh, well,
So
fantastic.
this is perfect timing for me.
Yeah, it's a great read. Um, and one of the things that McChrystal does really well is he opens with this incredibly powerful anecdote.
Okay.
One of his teams in Iraq just conducted a raid, and as they're going through the debris afterwards, they find a family photo.
Wow.
And it's this really stark reminder of the human cost of this conflict. But it also really highlights the complexity of the environment they're operating in.
Yeah. That's powerful stuff. I mean, to think about, they're going in, trying to complete their mission, but then that human element is right there in front of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And, speaking of complexity, the enemy they were facing, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, was unlike anything that they had encountered before.
Really?
Think about it this way. What's harder to fight, a traditional army or a swarm of mosquitoes?
Ooh, that's a good analogy. Yeah.
Right.
A swarm of mosquitoes every time. Yeah.
So AQI was decentralized,
Mm.
agile. They were constantly adapting. They were operating like a network. So it was almost like they were taking their cues from the startup world as opposed to kind of the traditional playbook of the military.
Huh.
So it really
A very different kind of enemy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to help illustrate just how different this kind of enemy is and how different the world has become, McChrystal gives this great example of what he calls the two Tareks.
Okay.
Okay, so imagine a Tunisian street vendor named Tarek in 1882.
Okay. I'm picturing him. Got it.
Right. Now, fast forward to 2010. Same guy, same job.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Now, you would think that it would be much easier to understand and predict the actions of the modern day Tarek.
Right.
I mean, we have so much more information about him. We might have his cell phone records, his internet browsing history, his social media, maybe even his Fitbit data.
Right.
But McChrystal's point is that it's actually much harder to predict the actions and the impact of the modern day Tarek because everything is so interconnected.
Yeah. One little thing can just cascade into this.
Exactly. It's like that butterfly effect.
Yeah.
One seemingly small action can ripple outwards in ways that are impossible to foresee.
That's so true. And it's not just on battlefields either.
Right.
I mean, we see this in business, we see it in politics, we see it in our own personal lives. The world is changing so fast, and it's just getting harder and harder to keep up.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what McChrystal and his task force had to realize was that the old ways of doing things, the things that had worked for decades, they just weren't cutting it anymore.
So what were they doing that wasn't working? What were those old ways?
Well, in the early days of the war, they were very much trying to apply the principles of scientific management.
Okay.
Kind of that Frederick Taylor model of breaking down tasks into their smallest components,
Yeah.
optimizing for efficiency, having very clear lines of command and control.
Oh, yeah.
That kind of classic top-down approach.
Yeah.
And what they realized was that in this complex, chaotic environment, that approach was actually making them less adaptable.
Huh. So it sounds like they were trying to impose order on a system that really just doesn't operate that way.
Exactly. You might be super efficient at packing your rucksack in a perfectly prescribed way, just like McChrystal's Rangers were trained to do.
Right.
But what happens when the situation changes and you need something from the bottom of your pack in a hurry?
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah. You're losing that adaptability. You're not as quick. You're not as nimble.
Exactly. And that's what McChrystal started to realize.
So they had to figure out something different.
They did. They had to figure out a new way of operating. And one of the concepts that really helped them do that was the idea of the butterfly effect.
Oh, okay.
Now, this idea comes from the work of Edward Lorenz, a meteorologist. And you may have heard of it. It's often phrased as the idea that a butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil could cause a hurricane in Florida.
Right, right. I have heard that. And it always sounds so far-fetched.
It is a bit of an oversimplification. But the underlying principle is actually incredibly important. What Lorenz discovered was that in complex systems, even tiny, seemingly insignificant events can have massive and unpredictable consequences.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. Like everything's connected.
Right.
And you never know what tiny little thing might set off a chain reaction.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's what McChrystal's task force was up against. They couldn't predict which events were going to spiral into major threats because in a hyper-connected world, everything is connected to everything else.
Yeah. So they had to be ready for anything.
They did. It was a huge challenge. It really forced them to completely rethink the way they were operating.
So how did they even begin to make decisions in that kind of environment?
Well, that's a great question, and that's where the idea of team of teams comes in. But before we jump into that, I think it's helpful to consider a few more examples of how this butterfly effect plays out in the real world, because it's not just a military problem.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Give me an example.
Okay, well, think about the spread of cane toads in Australia. They were introduced, with the best of intentions, I think, to control agricultural pests. But they ended up becoming this ecological disaster.
Oh, wow.
Or think about the 2008 financial crisis. No one saw that coming, even the experts.
No.
Or even just think about how one tweet or video can go viral and just completely destroy a company's reputation overnight. It really does feel like we're living in a world where those consequences of our actions, it's just becoming increasingly unpredictable. You're absolutely right. And I think that's why those traditional command and control structures that we've relied on for so long, they're just starting to break down. They're just not designed to operate in this kind of environment.
Okay. So the old ways aren't working.
No.
They're breaking down. But if McChrystal had to, completely rethink how they were approaching things, where did he even begin?
Well, that's what's so fascinating about this book. He didn't just try to tweak the existing system. He looked for inspiration in some pretty surprising places.
Okay.
From the training of Navy SEALs to the cockpit of a commercial airliner.
Oh, interesting. Now that you mention it, I do remember him talking about some airline crashes in the book.
Yeah. He contrasts two very different airline incidents to kind of illustrate this importance of adaptability.
Okay.
So he talks about the crash at United Flight 173 in 1978, where the crew was so focused on following procedures, they failed to see the bigger picture, and they ended up crashing the plane. And then he contrasts that with the Miracle on the Hudson in 2009, where the crew of U.S. Airways Flight 1549, they faced this totally unexpected crisis.
Right.
They lost both engines after hitting a flock of birds, but they were able to work together as a team and safely land the plane in the Hudson River.
Right.
So in one case, you have, rigid adherence to procedure leading to disaster. And in the other case, you have adaptability and teamwork leading to, what many people consider a miracle.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So what was the difference? Was it the leadership in the cockpit, or was it the training?
Well, it was a combination of factors, but I think one of the key differences was the mindset. In the case of United 173, the crew was so focused on doing things by the book that they lost sight of the bigger picture. They weren't thinking creatively, they weren't communicating effectively, and they weren't adapting to the changing circumstances.
So in a way, they were almost too efficient, too focused on just checking off the boxes and not really thinking critically about the situation.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's one of the dangers of becoming too reliant on procedures and protocols. You could lose that ability to think on your feet and adapt to unexpected challenges.
Right.
And so McChrystal recognized that his task force needed to move away from this traditional command and control model and towards something that was more like a team of teams.
Okay. Team of teams. We keep coming back to that phrase.
We do.
But I'm still not exactly sure what it means in practice. How do you take a massive organization with thousands of people and make it as agile and as adaptable as a small team?
That's a great question, and that's what we'll dive into in the next part of this deep dive.
So how do you actually build a team of teams? I'm really intrigued by this idea.
Yeah, it's a fascinating concept. And, McChrystal actually found inspiration in a rather unexpected place, Navy SEAL training.
Okay.
He was really struck by how SEAL teams are able to operate with such incredible speed and agility, even in those most chaotic and unpredictable environments.
Yeah. SEALs are known for being able to adapt and improvise on the fly. But how do you take those principles and apply them to a massive organization like a military task force?
Right. That was the challenge. And it wasn't easy. McChrystal realized that it wasn't just about training individuals to be more adaptable.
Okay.
It was about changing the entire structure and culture of the organization.
So it's not just about having a bunch of highly skilled individuals. It's about how all those individuals work together.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In traditional military hierarchies, information is often compartmentalized. People only share information on a need-to-know basis.
Right.
But McChrystal realized that in a complex environment, that approach was actually hindering their ability to adapt.
Because if you don't know what's going on, you can't make informed decisions.
Precisely. So he started to implement some pretty radical changes. He increased transparency by making sure that almost all communication was shared across the entire task force.
Wow.
And they started holding these daily operations and intelligence forums, or O&Is as they call them, where representatives from every unit would come together and share information.
That sounds like a great way to break down those silos and foster collaboration. But did people resist these changes? I mean, sharing information so freely, that kind of goes against the grain of traditional military culture, right?
Yeah, there was definitely some resistance at first. People were used to operating in a certain way,
Right.
and they were hesitant to give up control. But McChrystal was persistent. He led by example.
Okay.
He would regularly visit the front lines. He would talk to the troops. He emphasized the importance of what he called shared consciousness.
So it's not just about changing policies and procedures, it's about changing the mindset of the entire organization.
Absolutely. It's about building trust and creating a culture where people feel empowered to share information and make decisions without constantly having to go up the chain of command.
So what you're describing is like a fundamental shift in how we think about leadership, right? It's less about being the chess master who controls every move and more about being the gardener who creates an environment where the team can thrive.
That's a great analogy. And McChrystal actually uses that very metaphor himself.
Yeah.
He realized that in a complex environment, you can't micromanage everything.
Mm-hmm.
You have to trust your people. You have to empower them to make decisions.
You know, this reminds me of something I read recently about the prisoner's dilemma.
Uh-huh.
It's this classic game theory scenario that kind of demonstrates the power of trust and cooperation. Have you heard of this?
Absolutely, yeah.
So for those who haven't, the prisoner's dilemma basically shows that when individuals act in their own self-interest, it often leads to a worse outcome for everyone involved. But when they trust each other and cooperate, they can actually achieve a much better result.
Yeah, it's a great example of how collaboration can actually be more beneficial than competition in certain situations.
Exactly. And it seems to be at the heart of what McChrystal is talking about here.
Yeah.
You know, he had to convince everyone in the task force to trust each other,
Right.
to act in the best interest of the team, even if it meant giving up some individual control.
Right. And, he used these O&I forums as a way to foster that trust and cooperation.
Mm.
These meetings weren't just about sharing information. They were about building relationships and creating a shared sense of purpose.
So it's not just about the information itself, it's about the connections that are formed when people come together and share those perspectives.
Right. McChrystal realized that building a team of teams was about more than just improving communication. It was about creating a sense of shared understanding
Okay.
and a common goal.
I'm starting to see how this team of teams approach could be applied to all sorts of organizations,
Yeah.
not just the military. But I'm still curious about how it actually played out in practice. Like, did McChrystal's team actually see a difference? Were they able to become more adaptable?
They absolutely did. McChrystal describes several examples in the book of how this new approach allowed them to respond more effectively to threats, often outmaneuvering the enemy by making decisions much faster than they had before.
So it's not just about feeling good and having everyone on the same page. It's about tangible results. They were actually able to achieve their objectives.
Yes. And it wasn't just about achieving their military objectives. It was about creating a more sustainable and resilient organization. When you have a team of teams that are all interconnected and working towards that common goal, you're much better equipped to deal with unexpected challenges.
So it's about being proactive rather than reactive.
Exactly.
About being able to anticipate and adapt to change, rather than always being caught off guard.
Right. It's about creating an organization that's constantly learning and evolving,
Yep.
rather than one that's stuck in its old ways.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
We've talked about the challenges of operating in a complex environment, the limits of traditional command structures, and the principles behind building a team of teams. But I'm still wondering what this all means for our listeners. How can we take these principles and apply them to our own lives and our own work?
That's a great question, and that's what we'll explore in the final part of this deep dive.
I'm starting to see how this idea of a team of teams isn't just some abstract military concept. It's something that has real implications for anyone who's trying to navigate a complex world. Whether you're leading a team at work or managing a family or just trying to make sense of the constant stream of information that's coming at us every day.
Yeah, you might be surprised to learn that McChrystal actually sees a direct connection between the challenges he faced in Iraq and the challenges that someone like Frederick Taylor faced back in the industrial age.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. I mean, those seem like completely different worlds.
They are on the surface. But at their core, both Taylor and McChrystal were responding to massive shifts in the way the world worked. Taylor was trying to figure out how to manage factories that were becoming increasingly large and complex, and McChrystal was grappling with the challenges of fighting an enemy that was decentralized and constantly adapting.
So are you saying that we're in the midst of a similar shift today?
Absolutely. The technologies that are connecting us in ways we never imagined before, social media, the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, they're creating a world that is more complex and interconnected than ever before. And just as Taylor had to rethink the old ways of doing things, so do we.
Okay, but what does that look like in practice? What are some concrete steps that we can take to become more adaptable?
Well, one of the key takeaways from McChrystal's experience is the importance of breaking down silos and fostering collaboration. This might mean creating more opportunities for cross-functional teams to work together. Or it might mean simply encouraging more open communication and information sharing.
That makes sense. But I think a lot of people struggle with this. It's one thing to say, let's break down silos, but it's another thing to actually do it. People are often protective of their turf, and they may be hesitant to share information or collaborate with others.
You're absolutely right.
Hmm.
That's why it's so important to create a culture of trust and psychological safety, where people feel comfortable sharing their ideas and taking risks without fear of being punished for making mistakes.
So it's not just about changing structures and processes, it's about changing the underlying culture of the organization.
Exactly. It's about creating an environment where people feel empowered to act and make decisions without constantly having to go up the chain of command.
And this all comes back to McChrystal's idea of the gardener leader, right? The leader who creates the conditions for the team to thrive rather than trying to control every aspect of their work.
Exactly. It's about trusting your people and giving them the space to experiment and learn from their mistakes.
I think one of the biggest challenges for a lot of leaders is letting go of that control. We're so used to operating in a world where we're supposed to have all the answers, and it can be really difficult to admit that we don't.
I agree. McChrystal talks about how he had to learn to embrace uncertainty and become more comfortable with not having all the answers. He realized that in a complex environment, it's impossible to predict everything that's going to happen. So you have to be willing to adapt and adjust your plans as you go.
So it's about being comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yeah. And it's about trusting the process.
Yeah.
Even though it may feel chaotic and messy at times, McChrystal argues that this kind of emergent bottom-up approach is ultimately more effective than trying to impose a top-down plan on a complex system.
So instead of trying to control every detail, you create the conditions for the team to self-organize and adapt to changing circumstances.
Exactly. McChrystal uses the example of self-driving cars to illustrate this point.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, think about how self-driving cars work. They're constantly collecting data from their surroundings and communicating with each other to avoid collisions and optimize traffic flow. There's no central authority telling each car what to do, but the system as a whole is incredibly efficient and adaptable.
Oh, that's a powerful image. It really does challenge our traditional notions of control and leadership.
It does. And it suggests that the future of management may be less about command and control and more about creating the conditions for emergence and self-organization.
This has been such an insightful conversation. I'm already starting to think about how I can apply these ideas in my own life and work. But before we wrap up, is there one key takeaway that you want listeners to walk away with?
I think the biggest takeaway is that in a world of increasing complexity, adaptability trumps efficiency. If we want to thrive in this new environment, we need to embrace uncertainty, empower our teams, and be willing to constantly learn and adapt.
That's a great message. It's not always easy, but it's definitely essential. And for those of you who want to dive deeper into this topic, I highly recommend checking out McChrystal's book, Team of Teams. It's full of fascinating insights and practical advice for anyone who's trying to navigate a complex world.
It's a must-read.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into adaptability. We hope you found it as thought-provoking as we did. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep adapting.